All right, Patrice, let's talk about the individual side of this, because I understand that $40 a week, which is what most people are probably going to be getting, doesn't sound like a lot of money. On the other hand, I had dinner on Friday night with a single mother who works very hard to take care of her child, is special needs kid, so it costs extra money. $40 to her is an extra bag of groceries a week. That means a lot to her in particular, and I would imagine to millions of people all over the country.
It absolutely does. You know, I had a similar conversation just yesterday with defending the tax cuts and really explaining that, you know, for many Americans, it is difficult to come up with even $400 in case of an emergency. So whether it's $40 or an extra $100 a month, that is something that Americans can put aside for even for discretionary spending or for, you know, those things that pop up that are really difficult. And unfortunately, the media has done a great job of denigrating this tax bill and spreading misinformation and, frankly, lies about it. So when Americans start to see their paychecks increase, hopefully as early as February, I think that'll do a lot to dispel a lot of the lies.
Brian, you know, there was a lot of concern by deficit hawks, both the Republican and the Democratic Party, about the tax cuts, saying you have to find a way to pay for it. You have to pay for it. It's our money, so I don't think you have to find a way to pay for them taking less of our money. But on the other hand, the one thing that does concern me is when these deficit hawks start talking about infrastructure spending and saying, you know, that's the last thing we need right now is to spend billions more in infrastructure or for infrastructure when we didn't get much of a boost from the Obama stimulus. What do you say?
Well, I think that there's a smart way to do infrastructure, and that's public-private partnerships, state and local governments, including the private sector. Indiana's done innovative things. What we don't want to do is redo what they did with the stimulus, where you just take hundreds of billions of dollars, you pour it into projects that basically benefit donors and funders. You end up getting projects like Solyndra. We don't want this to be micromanaged out of Washington. Infrastructure should happen from the bottom up. It should be planned by local communities to see what they need rather than dictated by Congress based on donors. I think if you can do that and you can have some more private involvement, have it a little more grassroots, you can do this in a better way than top-down Washington.
Well, Scott, is there a way to use the tax system to incentivize companies to do that, to pay in a private sector way for infrastructure?
Well, there's certainly ways in which you could use, like the expensing provisions will allow a lot of companies to invest in capital investments. We could go a step further and allow them more expensing for, say, buildings and larger infrastructure projects. That was put off on the table because it was seen as too expensive. Now, we may actually have to look at funding those infrastructure projects by raising the gas tax. No one wants to talk about that. But if you want to pay directly for roads, you're going to have to raise the gas tax.
Patrice, that's something that would cut directly into the middle class.
It absolutely would. I think people will feel that very immediately. Now, we are looking at an economy that's strong and resilient. We're looking at low unemployment overall. So hopefully Americans would be able to absorb a little bit of a tax when they go to fill up at the pump. But, you know, they're getting a bigger paycheck. They're getting better paying opportunities because of a market that's like on fire. And they're seeing their 401ks and their retirement growing. So maybe it'll balance out.
Brian, there is the other fact. It's true. Most Americans don't own individual stock, but most Americans have some kind of pension plan, some kind of retirement plan, 401k, whatever it is. Do you think that they care about what happens with the stock market?
I think Americans care a lot what happens with the stock market. I know a lot of people who spend a lot of time, me included, looking at your 401k.
Well, you're kind of a numbers geek, though. I'm talking about folks who you know are at the factory all day.
Of course people look at their 401ks. I think that that's a common thing, and it's been a very good few years for their 401ks, and I think this has made a lot of families a lot more savvy about making sure that we do things to keep their 401k doing well. We keep the economy moving. We make sure that businesses have the ability to invest capital and to do better, because when they do better, your 401k does better.
Scott, how high do you think this tax cut program is going to allow the market to rise?
I'm not sure about the stock market itself, but when we modeled the tax plan, we found that it would boost, at least in the short term, the economy from, say, 2% annual growth to 2.4 to 2.5% annual growth over the next 5 years. It will begin to taper off.
What happened to that
3%
3% number that we heard from Donald Trump?
Well, it's going to take a little bit more. Like regulatory reform would be a big step in helping to unlock some of the pent-up business that are being frustrated by these regulations.
All right, guys, I want to move on if we can, because UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has signaled a major cut to the UN budget and saying that this $285 million a year is just the beginning. Brian, you and I have been up close and personal with the way the UN does business for decades now. What do you think about this? Are we finally going to see some real reform here?
Hopefully, because this is a legitimate cut. Right now, the U.S. funds 22% of the UN budget. We fund about $600 million a year out of their $2.7 billion budget. So we're going to pretty much cut it in half. By the way, we also put a couple $1 billion into actual peacekeeping and stuff like that across the globe. But for the actual UN budget, we fund 600 out of 2.7 billion, 600 million. This will help. Hopefully the UN will start to realize that if the United States is going to be funding so much of their budget, perhaps the UN shouldn't exist just to beat up on the United States and Israel.
Patrice, one of the reasons why more government spending doesn't work is because of accountability. It's much easier to hide your mistake if you're in the public sector because us taxpayers bail out those mistakes than in the private sector. In the private sector, you're fired. In the public sector, you just keep going on making mistake after mistake. The only thing worse than a bureaucracy is an international bureaucracy. There, which is what the UN is, it's impossible to make for accountability, right?
Oh, my goodness. The United Nations is bloated, it's inefficient, and it's ineffective. You know, you've got dictators who are barely allowing their people to survive and to eat on a daily basis, telling us what we should be doing as a sovereign nation, particularly most recently this vote on where we should locate our U.S. embassy. I think this is an important step. It sends a message to other countries that, yes, you should be able to vote with your dollar, so to speak. And hopefully other countries who have felt, well, you know what, we just need to go along with the agenda to be popular and like everyone else, will take that message and follow along.
And Scott, of course, you see these pictures that they put out of UNICEF babies that are being helped and everything. That's, there's some good causes at the United Nations, but the actuality is, and again, I've seen it up close and personal. I've lived in Manhattan for over 30 years now. You see all these UN personnel out at $500 lunches, drinking fine bottles of wine.
Right.
I know they don't have a provision in the accounting to say that, $500 for a bottle of wine, but at the same time, money is fungible. If Americans knew that their tax dollars were being used to pay for $500 lunches, they might be even more angry than they already are.
The bloat and the largesse at the UN are legendary. Brian has documented that extensively during his career and others. And, the fact that they put dictators on the Human Rights Council and things like that, they're completely out of touch. Yeah. And I think this will be a big wake-up call to those international bureaucrats that we mean business. We want some accountability for the dollars that we're sending there. And this ought to be a wake-up call to other international organizations as well, like the World Health Organization, the OECD, and others that have really lost touch with the people that are funding them.
Although, Brian, we've seen other administrations try to do this, and with some really good players like John Bolton, like Jean Kirkpatrick, like Dan Patrick Moynihan, both Democrats and Republicans trying to reform the UN. They've all failed. Is it conceivable that unless you just get rid of the organization or send the headquarters from New York to someplace like Timbuktu, you won't get real change?
I think the reason we haven't got real change is because in the past we just went and talked about it and we complained about it. I think once you pull back $285 million from their budget, that's a little more of a wake-up call. I think that might help a little bit more to get their attention.
Can they do it, Scott? Do you think they'll succeed?
Yes, I think it's a first step, and it's going to take Nikki Haley to continue to badger them to get the kind of results we're expecting.
And Patrice, again, when you think of what people in America need right now, when they haven't seen their salaries go up in 10 years, when you see the single mother that I was talking about before, very happy about being able to get an extra $40 a week for an extra bag of groceries, and then you think of how these people that are getting billions of dollars from taxpayers just waste the money. It really infuriates, no?
It absolutely does. Now, I will say, though, that there are a lot of females in particular who are probably doing better financially, and so we also have to make the case to them why this tax deal is a good deal and why also pulling our money out of the UN, if it's not being used effectively, is also important.
Yeah.